Today, it's our pleasure to host Dr. Matthieu Richelle. Dr. Richelle is a professor of Old Testament at the Faculté Libre de Théologie Évangélique in Vaux-sur-Seine, France. He's published several books in French, as well as scholarly articles in French and English related to the Hebrew Bible, archaeology, and ancient inscriptions. His first book in English is the subject of today's talk, The Bible and Archaeology. Dr. Richelle, it's a great privilege to be speaking with you today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So, this is a very interesting book, and in the beginning you state the claim that your purpose is to move beyond the sensationalist claims sometimes produced by archaeology. Obviously, many of us have heard those claims, but what prompted you to write a book specifically to deal with this problem?
Well, there were several reasons. First, I did a lot of research on archaeology for my PhD. It was about the story of ancient Israel. So I had all these things in my mind. And at the same time, I noticed that many Christians were struggling to understand what archaeology can tell them about the Bible. And you had opposite trends. Some books are claiming that archaeology confirms the Bible. It was the title of a book in French, L'Archéologie confirme la Bible. And on the other hand, there were books like The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein, which is a very good book, but that was saying other things. And people had difficulty to know how they could think about the relationship between the Bible and archaeology. So what I wanted to do, it was not just to present a list of illustrations of the Bible thanks to archaeology, but to understand what is going on and how we can think about this relationship.
And you really get into that in your first chapter after the introduction. You talk about what sort of methods archaeologists use and what kind of data they seek to collect. So just to put the question to you, being this is your specialty, how can a correct understanding of the role and the methods of archaeology enrich a reading of the Bible for lay people?
So there would be a lot to say, but two thoughts. On the one hand, people do not always realize how broad is the spectrum of data provided by archaeology. So many people do not assess correctly the breadth of things that we learn thanks to archaeology. For instance, there would be a temptation to think that archaeology is all about finding places or treasures or palaces, King David's palace and things like that, temples. And but archaeology is far more wide. It's wider than that. It's about unearthing all the past to the extent that it was preserved. So archaeologists, for instance, are interested in daily life, in what ancient Israelites ate, what they had in their food, in their drinking, how they lived in daily life. And archaeologists are asking themselves questions like, what was it about living in a house? The Bible does not tell you how an Israelite house looked like. It is archaeology that tells us this kind of thing. So on the one hand, people should be aware that archaeology provides a vast amount of data of different kinds. And this is what I gave so many examples in my first chapter. But on the other hand, some people are not aware that archaeology also has limits. So I wrote a chapter about that because it is sometimes impressive when an archaeologist says, oh, I have found this building and it dates from this century and it confirms what the Bible says, or on the contrary, it undermines it. A few weeks ago, there was a conference. I met an archaeologist, specialist of Jordan, And he told me, you know, when an archaeologist tells you that when he speaks in terms of century, you should not believe him. They are broader period. So there are many limits to archaeology, and that's normal, but you should be aware of them. And it's a balance. On the one hand, archaeology is fascinating. It's probably more fascinating than people realize. On the other hand, it has limits. So you have to balance the two facts.
And one of those sets of really fascinating data that archaeology can unearth for us, and something you've worked quite a bit on, is ancient inscriptions. And people get very excited about ancient inscriptions, as you well know, and you mention in the book. What ways, just a few examples, have inscriptions really enhanced our reading of the Bible, other than those sensational kind of claims of proving or disproving the Bible?
So a first illustration would be the Misha stele. A few weeks ago, there was an exhibition in Paris to celebrate the discovery of this stele. And the discovery was made 150 years ago. But it is still the most impressive example of ancient inscriptions that we have in the southern Levant. So you may have heard about King Misha. He is mentioned in the Bible in the second book of Kings. So he was a king of a small kingdom to the east of the Dead Sea in Jordan today. And he was a vassal to ancient Israel, so the northern kingdom, until he rebelled. So the Bible mentions this rebellion, and then the fact that the Israelite king led a military campaign to punish Mesha. And in the Bible, it is a story of victories until the Israelites reach the capital of Moab, and King Mesha makes a sacrifice of his own son, and the Israelites go back to their country. So that's a bit mysterious, but broadly speaking, it is a story of a victory of Israel, an interrupted victory. And then Bedouins in Jordan found a stele which is more than 1 meter high. It's quite impressive. It has more than 34 lines of script. And it is, to give you an idea, it's almost a biblical chapter. A chapter in the Bible of 30 verses, something like that. It's quite impressive. And in this stele, you hear the voice of King Mesha himself, who gives his own version of the story. So it tells you that, yes, he rebelled. His country was oppressed by Israel. But then he says that his own God, the god of Moab, Kamosh, helped him to be saved from Israel. And he says that he destroyed Israel forever. So this is royal propaganda, of course. But there are a lot more data in this, a lot more information in this stele. And he says that he fought wars against various places in the territory that was controlled by Israel. And then he built new temples, or he rebuilt structures all over the country. And this provides you an alternative account about the same period. And it's fantastic because imagine that most of the time, what we have is the voice of the biblical authors and redactors. And it is very rare to be able to compare to what other people would have said, because we don't have their Bible, so to speak. So ancient inscriptions enable you to compare different versions of the same events. That's really interesting. And they come from the earth, and they come from the period we are speaking. They were written not long after the events. So that's fascinating, and it requires a sophisticated approach, because as we saw, sometimes it contains propaganda. So it's not because it is ancient that it should be believed without a critical mind. So that's an example, but there are many other examples of ancient inscriptions that are relevant. Most of the time, what people find in excavations, it's just shards, ostraca, that are written with ink or incised, and they contain daily life messages, sometimes letters, sometimes only lists of people or commodities. And thanks to these inscriptions, you can look at what it was to live in ancient Israel. And sometimes they mention events too. For instance, there is an ostracon that mentions the prophet. It was a daily life message between soldiers, and they said, "Oh, the prophet said this." That's very interesting. Prophets were consulted in ancient Israel. So these are just two examples, but compared to the stones, the buildings that archaeologists find and unearth, inscriptions contain words, and you hear suddenly ancient people speaking, and it's very exciting when you're reading for the first time messages, texts that were in the earth for 2,500 years, and that nobody has read from this time. It's very exciting to rediscover that.
And you've done a lot of work with epigraphy and dealing with ancient inscriptions, and you address several of the issues kind of in approaching and the difficulties. And one that I kind of want to highlight that you speak about is the issue of forgery. So from a specialist perspective, could you explain for us what problems forgeries present and how, if at all, the public can combat the spread of forgeries?
Yeah, it's a big issue today in scholarly circles because many inscriptions, especially inscriptions that have been found, not always in excavation, but in the antiquities market, are so special, so interesting that it is a shame to discover that maybe they are fakes. And there has always been forgeries, even in antiquity. So it's a widespread phenomenon. And it raises several issues. There is a scientific issue. For instance, a few years ago, there was a manuscript of the Bible, a fragment of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 27. Very interesting. He speaks about the place where Israelites would build an altar. And it mentions Mount Gerizim. And it's very interesting. It corresponds to what Samaritans have in their own Pentateuch. And there is a whole debate among scholars about what was the point of the Pentateuch, what was it mentioning. It's very mysterious. Should Israelites build an altar and a temple, ultimately, in Jerusalem, which is not mentioned in the Pentateuch, or in Mount Gerizim, as Samaritans believed. This thanks to John chapter 4 and the discussion between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. So it's very exciting to find a fragment of Deuteronomy which mentions Gerizim, but it was not found during excavations. So should we use it in our scientific discussions or not? That's a big problem. That's just a scientific problem, but there is an ethical problem too, because it's not just the forgeries that are a worry, it's all of the unprovenanced items, inscriptions that are without provenance. We do not know where they come from. There are suspicions, there are claims made by antiquity dealers, but it's very difficult to know where they come in reality. So it involves forgeries sometimes, it involves authentic inscriptions too, but it also involves inscriptions that come from the plundering of museums in Iraq, or by ISIS, for instance, or the plundering of archaeological sites. People are doing excavations illegally and with bad methods. They unearth statues or tablets and they sell it. So this is a big issue from an ethical point of view. So today scholars are reacting, they're trying to improve things, and there are policies that have been designed to avoid making too much publicity to forgeries or to unprovenance items. So it's very complicated issues, because sometimes there are authentic inscriptions that are sold by antiquities dealers. So we do not want to miss treasures from the past. So with regard to the public, because that's your question, I think people should be more demanding when they hear news announcements made by archaeologists or by epigraphers, by scholars who claim that they have found an inscription, a spectral, sensational inscription. They should be aware that when it was not found in proper excavations, there is some suspicion, and you often have to wait a few weeks, a few months before second opinions by other scholars are published, and there is some suspicion. So that's a big issue. You know, a few days ago, you may have heard in the media, on the internet, about the Museum of the Bible in Washington, who has announced that 5 of the fragments of manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so to speak, that they had were fakes. So it's a progress. They announced it, but it gives you an idea of the problem, because it was sold at quite high prices.
It's a very lucrative problem.
Oh yes, not for scholars.
Yes, not for scholars, yes. So in the chapter, The Bible and Archaeology, What Kind of Relationship, you really get into the meat of the question behind what kind of relationship we should have as Bible readers with archaeology. And you begin by giving an overview of the approaches. And if you could, just for our audience, give a little outline of the approaches and how they developed historically in the field and where we are now.
Yes, thank you. That's very interesting, because it tells a lot about the way people relate to archaeology, and scholars especially. So in the beginning, is the 19th century, and still today for some people, there were scholars who thought that archaeology was all about finding things that are mentioned in the Bible, and the archaeology was just a means of confirming the Bible. So some people still think in these terms, but soon scholars realized that it was not correct, because archaeology is not just all about confirming the Bible. Sometimes there are problems too. And what they find when they excavate sites is far wider than just things mentioned in the Bible. You excavate sites that are not mentioned in the Bible, and that's very interesting. You excavate ancient cities that are mentioned in the Bible, but where you find periods that are not mentioned in the Bible. Later periods from the Byzantine times or Muslim times. So it's far more, it's broader than just comparing things to the Bible. And it raises false expectations, because you cannot expect to find everything that's mentioned in the Bible. And when you do not, people are disappointed. So it was a simplistic approach. So people moved on, and there was a big field that was named Biblical-archaeology. But as a technical term, it was represented by William Albright, which was a very important scholar in the 20th century, a very influential, quite impressive man. And they did not necessarily try to confirm the claims of the Bible thanks to archaeology, but they still had a positive approach of the relationship between the Bible and archaeology. And I am broadly speaking, but when it comes to comparing the Bible and archaeology, if a correlation can be made, they did not hesitate to make it. And they said, oh yes, it corresponds to what is mentioned in the Bible. But then some scholars realized that it was still a restrictive approach, or sometimes it was a restrictive approach, because it's not just biblical archaeology that people are doing. It can be archaeology of the Canaanites, for instance, or other people. Fantastic discoveries were made in Ugarit, cities in ancient Syria. They made fantastic discoveries there, and it's not Israelites. It's another civilization. Now, of course, it's related and simplistic when I say it's another civilization, but it's a culture, local culture, that should be compared to what is in the Bible, but that merits to be studied for itself. So now people are quite often speaking of Syro-Palestinian archaeology. That is, it's a geographical term. And they say, oh, we are studying everything you can find in ancient Syria and in Palestine as a geographical term, not a political term. And yes, they're trying to regard their field, archaeology, as an independent field, independent from the Bible. It's a progress, because if you say, oh yes, I know that I will find this because it is mentioned in the Bible, and then you find it through excavations, there is a risk of circular reasonings, and you will say, oh, I have found it, it confirms the Bible, but you use the Bible in the first step of your reasoning. So it's better to have excavations that are made without the Bible, and then perhaps we can compare things. And that's a very common approach today. And since then, there were more radical approaches. Some people were claiming at some point that archaeology should be the only historical source. The Bible was just fiction, a late fiction. But it's not a very plausible approach, because the Bible does contain historical realities. It mentions things that have been verified. So it is simplistic, and the Bible was not written just very late. It was written during centuries. And more recently, and it is more challenging, people have said that archaeology should have a premium when historians try to reconstruct the history of ancient Israel, because things are found in the earth. They come from the time we are speaking about, and they were not submitted to successive redactions at the Bible. And it's not ideological. People did not throw things in the soil just to wait for archaeologists to find them and be influenced by what they see. No, it's just people find what they have when they excavate. But there's a danger here, because archaeology is not a purely objective discipline. There are a lot of limits, a lot of interpretation is involved. It is the same as in biblical exegesis, a lot of interpretation is involved. So what I think is that we should make the most of both approaches, studying the Bible for itself, studying archaeological findings for themselves, and then comparing them in a cautious way. So today, the main question is this: what should have the priority? And in my view, it is still simplistic, because the Bible has to be studied critically, and archaeology too. So yes, that's a debate today.
It's a very complex question, but you try to you show the way that archaeology and the Bible can coexist when you give these test cases at the end of your book. And I think it would be a great opportunity to talk about the benefits of the debate over, in your example, your test case, the archaeology of the Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms. It's something that's been called into question recently, but you seem to take the perspective that the critical debate is ultimately for the best for understanding the history of the Bible and the methods of archaeology. If you could just take a moment to explain how you see this debate and what you think those great benefits are.
Yeah, for years, people archaeologists were saying that they had found buildings, palaces, or fortifications is in some key archaeological sites in Israel that corresponded to Solomon's kingdom. So they said, oh yes, Solomon has built Megiddo, Gezer, Hatzor, and in Jerusalem he made buildings, and we have found some of them, and it confirms that the Bible is right, is correct. Solomon was a great king, and he controlled an extensive kingdom, and he was a big builder. Yes, that was the approach for years, and then in the 1990s, scholars were beginning to say, oh, it's more complicated than that, because you cannot just say, oh, this building dates from the 10th century, the time of Solomon. Some of the buildings could date to the 9th century as well, and we have no means to decide. So actually, the first step was to challenge the traditional view, and the famous and great archaeologist Israel Finkelstein was the main proponent of the view that the buildings that have been found dated to the 9th century, and so they were ascribed to kings of northern Israel like Ahab, and actually in the time of Solomon, well, Jerusalem, Megiddo, Gezer, and so on were not that developed. The archaeological remains were not that developed. So there was a lot of resistance in scholarly circles because many archaeologists said, no, there are problems with this new view. And so it's a problem of chronology, 10th century or 9th century. And there was a lot of debate, a lot of sometimes acrimonious debate. And it has now maybe it's not settled today, but even people who disagree with Finkelstein's view, it is still a minority view in scholarly circles, but it is held by very important scholars. Even people who disagree with him have accepted the notion that it is not that easy to say that buildings date from the 10th century. Maybe that's probably the most important view, most widespread view among scholars today. Maybe we should just accept the fact that we cannot decide between the 10th and the 9th century when it comes to date buildings. Simply because, the main means we have to date buildings is the pottery, ceramics, because it has evolved through times. So archaeologists are able to say, oh, it is more or less late, but they are not able to say whether it comes from the 10th or 9th century. It has not evolved fast enough for us to be able to distinguish. So that's a problem. And what I find remarkable is that it is a technical issue, but if you have a broad view of the debate, you see that even people who disagree with Wittgenstein admit that he was right in saying that things are more complicated. We should be more modest. And also, it is not agreeable to say that we are going from certainty to uncertainty in debate. It is scientifically better to admit that there are uncertainties. So, yeah, it is progress for me as a scholar to know that we are not sure, and I think it would be very important. And this was one of the reasons why I wrote this book. It is important to say to the general public that scholars have not reached absolute conviction, and that's a problem because quite often archaeologists claim that they have found things, they date things, and they are quite sure of themselves. And it's better for publicity to say, oh yeah, I'm sure I've proved this. So some of them are very make quite strong assertions. And the reality, if you look behind the popular books, behind the announcements on the internet, is that there is scholarly debate, and it is very healthy to just to accept this fact. Maybe it will be settled in a few years. There are people in Israel, good scholars from Tel Aviv, who are doing a lot of radiocarbon datings. And maybe it will solve the problem. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, yes, we definitely will see. Something that enters into this debate about David and Solomon, the history of Israel, that I know you have particular interest in, is the literacy and writing in the ancient world. And this is the subject of your last chapter. And you mentioned that a lot of critical debate has attempted to lower the dates for the biblical texts on the basis of the lack of epigraphic material that we have from the earlier periods. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to expound on your own work that you've done with ancient inscriptions and ancient papyrus, and to just explain to us why we should be skeptical of some of the presuppositions and some of the evidences that people have used to lower the dates for the biblical text.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not trying to say that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, or that we are sure that that biblical books are very early. They were written very early. We do not know that. But I was a bit annoyed as an epigrapher to read in many papers biblical scholars who were asserting that because of the lack of ancient inscriptions from the 10th century or 9th century, and because of the poor archaeological remains found for this period, it was clear that biblical books or sources or redactions of the Bible could not have been made in Judah or ancient northern Israel before the 8th century BCE. You can read that in many papers and books. The Israelites or the people from Jerusalem were not able to write long texts before, for instance, the time of King Hezekiah, 700 BCE. And with colleagues who are specialists of ancient inscriptions, it was almost a joke to say that, no, you cannot say that. So I looked into the evidence and I tried to show that the quantitative approach, which is that, yes, for the 10th and 9th century BCE, there are not many inscriptions. It's not really relevant here, because for any period, except for the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is really an exception, for many periods, from the 10th to maybe the 4th century BCE, we do not have impressive inscriptions. Actually, for the royal period, the monarchy in ancient Israel, so it's 4th century, we only have one papyri from ancient Israel, one papyri. And we know that papyrus, and we know that hundreds were written because we find seals that were used to seal them, and we know that many of them existed. So what we find is just a very small amount compared to what existed. Even for, let's say, the Persian period. So it would be from the end of the 6th century to the 4th century. Most biblical scholars say that many books were copied and written at that time in Judah. But we do not find any substantial text, long text in excavations. It does not happen. So why? Because papyrus was a material that disappeared through time. Even in Egypt, many papyri disappeared because of the humidity. So, so the quantitative approach to say, it's not impressive, we find only a few strata for the 10th and 9th century, it's not a good approach, because what we find, what we can expect to find, is just daily life inscriptions, which were written on ostraka, for instance, or stones, but we cannot expect to find long text. By definition, they were written on media that disappeared. So that's one of the points in the debate. Another point was that people and scholars quite often assert that you need to have a high level of development in a country for people to be able to produce literature. And I think it is a bit simplistic. First of all, we are not always able to assess what is the level of development of societies. It's quite a complicated issue. And then it depends on the archaeology of, for instance, Jerusalem in the 10th and 9th century. And it is still hotly debated among scholars. You know, some scholars believe they found the palace of King David. Others say no, it's later. These buildings are late. And there is still a debate. So we cannot assert that it is clear that Jerusalem was well developed, if it means something, in the 10th century, or whether it was, or that it was not developed at all, it was just a tiny town. And we do not know that. At least some people believe they know, but the reality is that there is a debate and it is not settled today. So even if we assume that there is a correlation between the level of development of ancient societies and the rise of literature, which I do not really believe, even if we assume that, then we have to note that the debate is not settled about Jerusalem. So I think it is not possible, thanks to archaeology, to say that there was no literature, no Hebrew literature, before the 8th century. And actually, I'm not claiming that biblical books were necessarily produced before that. That's a whole discussion. Maybe there were other texts about Baal and Asherah and other gods, or other stories that were produced by scribes. Why not? Maybe the Bible is not just all that was produced as literature in ancient Israel. So it's more complicated than what many scholars believe. And I was troubled, was perplexed when I saw maybe biblical scholars who use archaeology to solve the issue of literacy in ancient Israel. It is more complicated than that. So, yeah, I just wanted to look into the evidence and to say that, oh, it's more complicated. Maybe there were texts already in the 10th century, in the 9th century. It would be more complicated in the second millennium, because the script was probably not the same. It evolved through time. It was not normalized in the previous centuries. It was normalized maybe the 11th century. And before that, the alphabetic script was not used in the same way as during the first millennium BCE. So that was the issue.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And just one final question. At Unitas Fide, one of our passions is for seeing the church globally united. And so I'd like to ask you a question we've asked to several of our authors. What would it mean for the church to be united? How would Christians recognize this unity? And what can we do as Christians to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed in John 17?
Yeah, maybe what I can tell you that might be useful, helpful, is what I live, what I see in my life as a scholar. And what I see is that people who study the Bible, whether they are Catholics or Protestants or Orthodox, they go along quite well because they have something in common, the Bible. And biblical scholars are sometimes quite amazed, at least in my country in France, to see that there is almost no difference when they study the Bible between them. Religious convictions does not prevent them to work together and to pray together. A few weeks ago, we had a meeting in Paris of a Catholic network of scholars, and it is a national network of scholars. It was Catholic in the beginning, but now there are many Protestants, as myself, in this association, and we work together, we study the Bible together, and sometimes there is more difference between two Protestants than between a Protestant and Catholic. And it is a scholarly enterprise, but at the same time, I enjoy at least the fact that I am regarded as a brother by my Catholic colleagues, and we had an ecumenical celebration. So we prayed together, we sang together, we read text from the Bible together, and I am quite impressed by the fact that studying the Bible, which is something we have in common, enable us to spend time together and to share sometimes very spiritual thoughts. So that's encouraging to me, because there are a lot of theoretical issues or discussions in ecumenism, but in at a very concrete level of discussions between scholars on the Bible, yeah, things are going on quite well. But my other thought is that for this kind of thing to happen, and this is one of the ways that unity is manifested, working together, studying the Bible together, praying together. For this to happen, you have to have deep core convictions about other Christians. If you don't accept them as Christians, if you have doubts about the purity of their faith or something like that, if you think that you are the only one to own the truth, then you can't really do this. So you better have to think these things through before. And if you have core convictions about that, then it helps a lot. My core conviction would be that God is working with different churches and is doing impressive and fantastic things with Catholics, with Orthodox, with Protestants. And if God is doing this, if the Spirit of God is able to work with all these different people who are probably wrong with many issues. Nobody is perfect. I'm probably wrong on many issues. If God is ready to work with them, why should I not be ready to work with them? So I'm very interested in what God is doing at the concrete level with people. And I can see a Catholic church in my town where the priest is really preaching the gospel and lives are changed. And for me, it's encouraging. So just accepting the fact that God is doing fantastic things in different churches, it helps me a lot.
Well, thank you for that wisdom, and I just want to thank you one more time for being with us.
Thank you very much.